overshoot, and all that it discounts. By the counterintuitive. Overshoot means to go further than the end of or past something without intending to. This year, Earth Overshoot Day was July 24th. Using the overshoot formula, humanity's resource consumption for the year had already exceeded Earth's capacity to regenerate, footprintnetwork.org. Yet that has been the case for a while now, since the experts began measuring, 1971, getting worse in terms of overshoot, a theory that eventually points to collapse. The collapse or state of rapid decline of many things, natural, societal, economic, and political. Why? Because we are beyond carrying capacity of the Earth. The day should be renamed and celebrated as Earth Collapse Day, a global siren about the disintegration and demise of our techno-industrial civilization itself. Ecological overshoot is the phenomenon which occurs when the demands made on a natural ecosystem exceed its regenerative capacity. Global ecological overshoot occurs when the demands made by humanity exceed what the biosphere of Earth can provide through its capacity for renewal. Wikipedia definition. Less than 10% of the world's population is currently aware of the above phenomenon. Even less are actually concerned with such a global verdict, the exigency and not really exceeding any demands. The reasons for not being aware are different, as much as our real needs, concerns, and fears, shaped together by many crises, material reality and phenomenon. As of now, ecological overshoot is still a matter for the experts and activists to measure humanity's demand for and supply of natural resources and ecological services. Overshoot experts tell us about the hockey stick phenomenon based on human activities. Over the last 150 years, the baseline taken as the Second Industrial Revolution. A spectacular rise of GHG emissions, population, pollution, urbanization, meat consumption, loss of biodiversity, ecosystem collapse, ocean warming, acidification, extinction rate, land use, extreme climate events, loss of ice, and the list is long and preposterous. Factors that are all exceeding the so-called Earth's ecological budget. Globally speaking, a phenomenon that has overwhelmed many of us, well as those who wish to theorize, model, propagate, and impose behavior scenarios and a range of sustainable solutions upon billions of people, all living organisms, the entire planet if possible. Been going on for almost 50 years. Why they wish to do so is not the concern here, as much as what all overshoot and ecological overshoot discounts, and by construct fails to address. Why such global frameworks are misleading, like many false broad consensus of the past. How ecological overshoot as a guiding principle, however well-meaning and scientific, is at the service of capitalism and its corresponding green arithmetic out to control and reform all types of excess caused by modern humans. What about the overshoot of capitalism? The divisive binary of society versus nature. The terrifying results of infinite growth that frames the broad consensus of world ecology, eventually at the service and conservation of capitalism and hierarchy of race, class, and gender. What is global ecological debt? According to the IPAT equation, carrying capacity, the continued overexploitation of natural resources results in ever more severe damage to global ecosystems over time. This has destabilized many micro-ecosystems, causing increasing extinction rates, and the macro-ecosystems are coming under increasing pressure. The overexploitation of natural resources is most often related to the modes of production, and high-income groups disproportionately consume natural resources, as well as contribute to climate extremes worldwide, nature.com. It is a no-brainer that severe damage to global ecosystems over time has happened in reality because of the historical process of capitalism, productivism, and infinite economic growth that has brought great benefits for a few at the cost of everyone else and the entire planet. By blaming the entire human population for such a global catastrophe and incoming collapse is a great disservice carried on by overshoot experts and by very many planetary managers. Managing the planet? Since the 1970s, the global population is increasingly compromising the Earth's ecosystem, global footprint network. The above verdict manages to create a global understanding, albeit omitting certain fundamental conditions, of capital accumulation, neoliberal economics, and the infinite proliferation of technology and all its corresponding demands. Three underlying drivers of the biosphere crisis, as well as a range of disastrous outcomes now being confronted by us at varying levels. No nation can be an exception to the above zeitgeist. The global footprint model discounts the impact of capitalism, the actual debt, and the eternal myth of cheap nature. That capitalism has finally run into its own overshoot and incoming collapse, and has effectively bankrupted the planet and the future for coming generations. To be clear, capitalism is a way of organizing nature, and not just an economic system or preferred form of prosperity generation. Capitalism's governing conceit is deeply embedded within world ecology, an utterly devious logic that capitalism may do with nature as it pleases, that nature is external and may be coded, quantified, and rationalized to serve economic growth, social development. Jason Moore, Capitalism in the Web of Life. One affirmation signed by 96 economists, Nobel Prize laureates, 1969 to 2024, about capitalism being able to achieve higher good. The same higher good that was ordained by rapid scientific discovery, standardization, mass production of the Second Industrial Revolution. A historic phase that represents mass alienation of people, families, and labor, starting in Europe and then in North America, repeating like a pattern in every part of the world being industrialized and standardized. The overshoot of capital, mechanical power, and Western science. Individuals have the power to better their homes and communities, build resilience over time to combat the climate crisis. Overshoot, footprint-network.org. The power of neoliberal affirmations also provides a range of solutions and reforms, such as rewilding, food waste management, plant-based meals, circular companies, recycling, solar/microgrids, financing decarbonization projects, land stewardship, indigenous knowledge systems, etc., etc. Is prescient here to understand that the wealthiest population groups all over the world have disproportionately influenced present-day climate change, have disproportionately influenced world policies, world share, and all its benefits for a long while now. Call that category of people 1% or 10%, hardly changes the extreme inequality. Link emissions inequality over the period 1985-2020 regional climate extremes using an emulator-based framework. We find that 2/3, 1/5 of warming is attributable to the wealthiest 10%, 1%, meaning that individual contributions are 6.5-20 times the average per capita contribution. Nature.com. Emissions from the wealthiest 10% based in the United States, Canada, Qatar, and China alone led to a 2- to 3-fold increase in heat extremes across vulnerable regions, 2015 to 2020. They call it carbon inequality, absolutely in sync with every form of inequality within capitalism. Overshoot of exploitation. When we speak about or address labor exploitation, most often the narrative is based around factory workers, farmers, undocumented people, truckers, taxi drivers, gig economy, etc. Yet, the exploitation of women by itself is a gigantic problem across the world, and perhaps no nation is an exemption. The exploitation of nature and that of women is fundamental for the continuation of capitalism. Women cannot free their bodies or change their identities unless they don't challenge and change the material conditions of their very lives first. As feminists, we all know that much. Leading feminist figure in Europe, Silvia Federici expands the material dialectic as, "The history of capitalism, women have been subjected to a far more intense discipline than men. We saw that capitalism reached more deeply into our lives, appropriating not only our labor, but our entire bodies. I refer to the state's control over our reproductive capacity, over procreation, over our sexuality. This is because our reproductive capacity has been placed at the service of the reproduction of workers, beyond the periphery of the skin." An interview with Silvia Federici. No doubt that a particular weight and resonance for those that have suffered most under this global system are women, disproportionately again those women situated in the global south, the poorest and the indigenous. The science of ecological overshoot remains divorced from the underlying social expectations that are tied to a woman's role. A reproductive worker, as a person whose social task is to serve men in varying capacities. Such is the living reality of a vast number of women, except those who have achieved a higher ground, higher education, and emancipation. Since the late 1960s, following many proletarian struggles that included the rights of the decolonized, the indigenous, and women across the world, questions of birth vis-a-vis population have been framed by a Western bourgeois logic of performance and accumulation, and not by individual women or collective reasoning. Earth scientists, demographers, policymakers, and ecologists began to speak of a population explosion and the need for population control. The concern has also served to justify the existence of poverty in the midst of obscene private wealth accumulation, and to shift the blame from colonial exploitation, old and new, to the women of the world, accused of producing too many children, Caliban and the witch, Silvia Federici. Neo-Malthusian dread and all its capitalist tendencies are favored by a tiny group of people, almost all situated within the First World, worst ecologies of fear nesting inside settler colonial societies. Deeply devoted to the capitalist logic of extraction, accumulation, and conversion as the foundational logic of their society. Whatever eco-hogwash and in-depth studies they may attribute to in the name of ecological overshoot is secondary and most often self-reinforcing, is the very reason as a science ecological overshoot cannot achieve a global dialectic, bring people closer to nature, nor actually provide sustainability for all. Yet the complicity of patriarchy and capitalism is key as a background condition. Population control became a mantra first with the IMF, World Bank, and range of policymakers directing capitalist systems of exploitation that structures how women across nations and class may act and perform. The overshoot of exploitation, directed specifically at women, is missing within every calculation of resource exploitation. Almost 50% of the world's population, women, have been excluded from the exploitation and understood instead as a resource. For regeneration, indentured labor, and even slavery. An estimated 52 million people are living in situations of modern slavery on any given day in 2021, according to the estimates of modern slavery. Women numbering millions, based in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Niger, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Kuwait, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and other nations, have been forced into slavery and forced marriage, according to Walk Free Global Slavery Index 2022. Like one cannot separate the economy from the environment, likewise one cannot separate inequality of gender from the inequality of wealth. What appears at the backdrop of population control and women's reproductive rights is control over the birth of new generations, of Africans, Latin Americans, Indians, Chinese, Caribbean, etc., those very people fighting to reclaim the wealth that was taken away from their native regions, still at war with the ravenous demands of capitalism, the ruling class and its economies of extraction/destruction. For all the forecasting and prediction, by the science of overshoot, it discounted the organization of capitalism. Ignored back then by a range of Earth scientists and systems thinkers, like Earth 2.0 J. Forrester, the limits to growth, Donella Meadows and the MIT Group, the Club of Rome Overshoot, the ecological basis of revolutionary change, William R. Catton, Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich, etc. World ecology and its praxis of overshoot would remain devoted to the central tenets of capitalism and first world economic imperialism. In a nutshell, economic imperialism can be understood as new enclosures, where land is acquired by private corporations and trading agreements, following the same logic of enclosure of earlier centuries. Privatization of land, the destruction of the commons, always leads to many negative ecological and social changes. Federici. Hence, what about the overshoot of enclosures that has gone unchecked for decades now on every continent? What do the planetary managers have to say about it? Actually nothing, and instead they are out to convince the world of some planetary emergency. Federici reminds us that the capitalist class wants to decide who can reproduce and who cannot, in the same way as they want to decide who can live and who must die. Overshoot of wealth accumulation. The 2022 Global Inequality Report provides many insights into rising wealth inequality all over the world. Post-COVID, wealth gap between the richest and poorest got even more. Yet the same report does not dare mention the words globalization and capitalism, the primary reasons for all such irreversible inequality and rising destitution. Wealth inequality crisis or epidemic, as richest 1% account for half the world's wealth, Spencer Woodman. The utopian vision of a world where so-called individual freedom and liberty for all guaranteed by an economy based on private property rights has proven to be an absolute scam, or at best yet another broad consensus of the past, now worth laughing at. At best, a part of the world's population can check into a supermarket or an airport, while the upward flow of wealth and accumulation goes unchecked. guaranteed by all the hyper-deregulation and neoliberal markets of achievement. Urbanization and capital accumulation go hand in hand, David Harvey. Now that half of the world's populations live in cities, gives rise to not just population overshoot and overconcentration of energy, resources, water, and everything important, but also major housing crisis, the homeless and abandonment. So questions of daily life in environments constructed for the purposes of capital accumulation, as the overshoot of every megacity is a gigantic contradiction of capital accumulation itself. A source of conflict, economic failure, and in certain cases civil war even. The direct link between tax havens, tax cuts, rentier finance capitalism, and globalization that has set off an explosion in the wealth of the super-rich, Forbes 2022, is sufficiently clear. While almost everyone wants to be rich and prosperous, the prospects of human well-being are diminishing at a global level. Adding to our list the overshoot of debt and the overshoot of poverty. The wealthy who benefited from the global fortunes following the 2008 crash, with wealth inequality rising across all regions, except for China, where median wealth declined since 2017. But the overshoot of wealth includes billionaires who are Chinese, Russian, Indian, Australian, Nigerian, Egyptian, German. It's multinational. Some people call them moneyed psychopaths, and some prefer the 1%, or worse, mobs with pitchforks are coming. Eliminate them before they get down to eliminating us. Yet far greater is the wealth and power of fossil capital. Global warming is not so much an outcome of ecological overshoot, but that of the overshoot of fossil capital. Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Fossil energy-based business and economies, or the major part of organization of capitalism, that has gone totally unchecked, is also the common devotion of every major nation and corresponding political economy. The common devotion and means of wealth generation based on cheap energy, however seemingly different they may appear, the multipolarity of the same fossil capital-based system. We hear a lot of good things about BRICS and a lot of bad things about the West and its vampire capitalism. How stupid, when both sides will collapse in a matter of days without fossil capital. Be it China or America, Canada or Venezuela, Brazil or Saudi Arabia, Kuwait or Nigeria, Russia or Germany, the global North or the South, all hogtied to the economies and entire techno-industrial systems of fossil capital. Energy that eventually is turned into the very material overshoot complicit in destroying the biosphere and the lives of their own citizens. Funny, but one cannot give up on transformation, and they are crystal clear in their motivation as the new Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. But remember what happened with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968-70. But even the overshoot of wealth has to concur with limits, regardless if one wishes to colonize Mars, Elon Musk, or spray vaccines on food crops, Bill Gates, or build a golden dome over their settler colonial project, Donald Trump. I believe that all good things taken to an extreme get self-destructive, and that everything must evolve or die. This is true for capitalism. Bridgewater, world's #1 hedge fund, managing over $125 billion in assets. Overshoot has no objective meaning for a society of achievement. The majority of people who wish to get rich, one way or another, and sooner the better. And quote, men today are weak in quote. How to master power, money, influence, and reinvent yourself, Patrick, Bet David. We are living in an era defined by a gaping and growing divide between the haves and have-nots, Teresa Gallardici. Thousands of photos of various billionaires and political leaders standing together punctuates the reality and the overshoot of numbers that tell the story of a deep divide between the elite and workers. 7 alarming facts about wealth inequality. Bring on the pitchforks. For billions of people, the persistent discrimination in every aspect of their lives cannot be resolved by peaceful reform or new mantras or just by stories of system change. Not unless the capitalist mode of production and its disastrous laws of motion are eliminated altogether as an organized response. Back to measuring footprint size of overshoot is fraught with debate as well as limited to a set of factors, such as 6 mutually exclusive land use types: cropland, grazing land, forest, fishing ground, built-up land, and the area of forest required to offset human carbon emissions, the carbon footprint. Worldly impacts in terms of overshoot of social disruption, exodus, police violence, geopolitical conflicts, extreme climate events, economic crash, etc. have all been ignored. A rigid and practically useless theory confronts us in the name of overshoot. The interpretation is that humans are exceeding the regenerative capacity of Earth's ecosystems and therefore depleting stocks of natural capital, a state known as overshoot. Tracking the ecological overshoot of the human economy. We all have read critiques of capitalism based on moral categories: evil, greedy capitalists versus impoverished, badly treated workers, or more recently, environmentally callous capitalists versus the ecologists, earth scientists, angry teenagers, activists, concerned public, and some politicians even. Moral and ethical objections remain, but secondary to the systemic problem of why and how to replace the existing modes of production and current inequality by some other way of meeting human wants and needs. For all and not just a few. We find little synchronicity between very many observations about the biosphere crisis and the coming future. To think that modernity is an adequate way to deal with current complexity, I'm sorry, but there is too much evidence that it isn't adequate. Ruben Nelson, Foresight, Canada. The journal Science Progress in 2023 hypothesized that the environmental crises our planet faces today are the direct result of the human behavioral crisis. With ecological overshoot driven by economic growth, marketing and prenatalism, the social and institutional pressures to have children. Consequently, it also provides recommendations as a concerted, multidisciplinary effort to target the populations and value levers, most likely to produce rapid global adoption of new consumption, reproduction, and waste norms congruent with the survival of complex life on Earth. This line of thought and its backing science treats human behavior as both a problem and a solution. It discounts the impact of capitalism, modern technology, and a globalized neoliberal culture, acting upon the average human being. Instead, it emphasizes on the role of marketing or propaganda in promoting hyperconsumption and consequent ecological overshoot. Yet there is nothing new here. Thousands of campaigns and reforms, rebranded in dozens of languages, have shifted responsibility onto the individual, the consumer, the aware citizen, the aspiring youth, the entire proletariat even. But behavior is embedded within complexity of social, cultural, economic, institutional, and physical systems, and not just incentive structures and lifestyle changes and technological transitions. At best, the ongoing energy transition would address a single symptom of ecological overshoot, while every other destructive and irreversible impact of capitalism and the globalized, extraction-based economies of high-income nations, Nature.com, will go on as is. Every year, the rich nations overshoot their resources before poorer ones, according to GFN. The US, Australia, Denmark, and Canada overshot in the beginning of March, while Cuba, Nicaragua, Iraq, and Ecuador don't overshoot until December. Given the broad influence and popular appeal of the ecological overshoot and footprint, its measurement and underpinning assumptions are botched and fail to address the root cause, instead blaming all human beings the same, marked for overshoot. To summarize, a range of large-scale and complex phenomena surely entails simplifications, biases, errors, and gaps. And that said, overshoot and ecological footprint, both are a poor representation of how badly we are managing the planet, because a wide range of studies indicate that harm to Earth's ecosystems is already significant, irreversible, and we know well as to what has caused it and who all continue to profit from the existing world system. Is ecological overshoot and footprint good science? Perhaps, yet it does nothing to actually challenge or transition from the capitalist organization, exploitation, and destruction of life on the planet. For that very reason, it has been embraced by a range of people who prefer to quantify climate impacts, yet as wealthy emitters, never compare themselves to the global average nor face the major negative impacts of capitalism. As yet. In case you wish to pledge support with a paid subscription, click here.